Good morning. How are you all? Welcome to our time for telling. Unfortunately, I think some people think it's a time for marching, but some of those may come along later and join us. What we're here for today is to allow the descendants of the South Sea Islanders to tell us their stories. So we're going to have a whole series of sessions through the day at which we're going to hear some of the stories that these people have lived and their background, their parents, their grandparents, and I think it's going to be a really excellent series of sessions. My name is Sean Dorney. I'm a journalist with the ABC. I first went into the South Sea Islands. I went to Papua New Guinea in 1974. I was there for 3 years on secondment to the National Broadcasting Commission of Papua New Guinea and chased after, wooed and finally successfully convinced a Papua New Guinean woman who was a broadcaster to marry me. Pauline is from Manus Island, and although she wasn't blackbirded, I think she does feel that many of the years we've been married, she's felt it's not much better than indentured labour. But she's an extremely proud South Sea Islander, and our children are exceptionally proud of their heritage, and we've now got 3 grandchildren. My son, who's mixed sort of Irish, Australian, Melanesian, married a Norwegian Australian, so the mix is quite remarkable. But our granddaughter, Abby, at one stage asked Pauline if she was one of the original Australians. And Pauline said that she wasn't. She was a very proud Indigenous woman, but Indigenous for Manus. But I think there is that connection there between the Indigenous people of Australia and the South Sea Islanders. She was less pleased later when Abby, at one stage, Pauline was helping clean her up after she went to the toilet. She was aged about 3, and she said, "Nana, your skin is the same colour as my poo." The innocence of a 3-year-old, but unfortunately, I think a lot of those original blackbirded South Sea Islanders weren't treated much better than my granddaughter's poo. But we're here to hear some stories today, but to begin, just a little bit of housekeeping. If you do feel the need to leave, we're requesting people leave through the back door rather than through the front. There are also toilets up at the back and also out the side here. And at the end, people would like you to fill in that form that's been distributed outside, if you could, before you finish the day. I'd now like to introduce Louise Dunoon, the Acting Director, Content Development of the State Library of Queensland and Executive Manager, Content Development for Queensland Memory. Louise.
Hi everyone, and thanks so much for being here, and great to see some familiar faces. Last night was a great night as we celebrated the opening of the whole weekend and celebrated that. Last night, Des Sandy offered us a welcome to country for the whole weekend of commemorations, the Memories of a Forgotten People, the Cross-Cultural Precinct Initiative. And this morning, before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and pay respects to their ancestors who came before them. It is a privilege to be here and to make that respectful statement. But I would like to welcome everyone, as I said, and particularly the Australian South Sea Islander elders who are here, many who've travelled, who'll be speaking quite a distance to share their stories, and what a generous gesture and possibility that is. So this weekend has been much anticipated and planned, and I'm delighted that this is an opportunity, hopefully, for lots of exchange, for people to share their stories, listen and learn about the remarkable history of Australian South Sea Islanders in Queensland. It was deliberately titled The Stories of a Forgotten People because it is such an unknown story to so many people. And SLQ, State Library, is proud to be able to support this event, and really this is part of our commitment to the co-creation of Queensland memory, that we do have many collections here that have been digitised this year that community members have researched and looked at, but it's when those collections come to life, when they're added to, when they're help inform a much bigger picture of the telling of the Queensland story, and you can't do it. We need to be working together on that. So today is being recorded, and this will be available on our website, so people who can't be here today can listen and hear the stories. So just be aware of that as the day unfolds. Because today, I think to hear the lived experiences, the family stories, the community knowledge, the archival research that's being done, so generously being shared by more than 16 speakers. So it is going to be a fantastic day. So Queensland Art Gallery, Gallery of Modern Art, Queensland Museum and the State Library of Queensland are all custodians of different aspects of Queensland's cultural heritage, along with many other institutions. And we do have a shared responsibility to share our collections and understand and interpret our history. And that's why we came together to present this weekend. So this sesquicentenary, the 150th year, has been an opportunity to work together at a curatorial level. And I would like to acknowledge all of whom are here today, Ruth McDougall from the Art Gallery, Olivia Robinson from SLQ, and Imelda Miller from Queensland Museum. That little team has been the group that has driven a lot of the activity and planning. So it is my pleasure to invite Imelda Miller, who works at the Queensland Museum and edited our Australian South Sea Islander blog. So Imelda not only made a phenomenal contribution for the Queensland Museum, I think more phenomenal was perhaps the strength and knowledge and skills that she's offered to the Art Gallery and to the library. That we thank you, Imelda, and we welcome you to speak.
Thanks, Louise, for those kind words. I'd also just like to acknowledge my colleagues, Ruth McDougall and Olivia Robinson, for all the efforts that they've put into making this weekend come to fruition. You both should be commended for the work you've done. So just getting started, I'd just like to acknowledge that there is a walk happening this morning, so there's lots of events happening around Queensland this weekend, this week, over the next few weeks. And, and I think, it's important to acknowledge that they are telling a story. We have been now here as South Sea Islanders living in Queensland for 150 years. We've been living and moving throughout the landscape, crossing backwards and forwards into the island backdrops of our ancestors. But very little is still written about the evidence of us living in this landscape. After deportation, islanders remained here and they were heavily legislated against, especially in the sugar industry, an industry they knew well and they worked well within. However, South Sea Islanders continued living and working in this landscape, finding friends with and amongst the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and other wider Australian audience communities, They worked as drovers, railway workers, domestics, and we worked in hospitals, but we do very little about it, as in talking about it with one another. We experienced the war, many wars, we experienced flood, we experienced drought. We've been through all of that. but we do not talk about it. We even continue our island connections with our ancestors and go back to those ancestral islands. And still, we don't talk about it enough. Today, A Time for Telling is about opening up this conversation, about acknowledging our past, looking at what we're doing today in our own little ways, and the legacy we're leaving for future generations, so that they know what our dreams and our wishes are for them. This is for everyone. Today, I encourage you to participate in this conversation, whether it be in this room, at lunchtime, or when you go back to your family and friends this evening, and have these conversations and continue this ongoing dialogue about Australian South Sea Islander history in Queensland. I was honoured this year to work with the State Library of Queensland to interview one of Queensland's favourite sons, Mel Meninga, and his brother, Jeffrey. I was enlightened that he had another story other than football to talk about. And and he has a very clear message what he would like to say to the community today. And I'd just like to we'll start by showing a little bit from that. But I'd just like to say I wish everyone a great symposium, and let this be a time for telling. Thank you.
I'll always identify with being an Australian South Sea Islander. It's right to my core. It's how I live my life with the values that I was brought up with as an Australian South Sea Islander. It was a great upbringing. All those core values I learnt as a young kid around family is still there entrenched in my heart. That's how I live my life now. That's what I impart back to my children. I think it was shame about our history a little bit, when you hear stories all the time from Pop and Dad, but didn't give you a really in-depth understanding of where your ancestry lies. Because Pop and Gran didn't talk about it too much. They just wanted to look into the future and give us a good life, and Mum and Dad were probably the same as well. We'd like a fuller picture of our background. Our elders are obviously passing away, and those stories get put in the grave with them. I think we all got a responsibility to put all the pieces together and to find out a bit more about our history. At the end of the day, it's about family, I reckon. My heritage is an Australian South Sea Islander, and I'm very proud of that, and that's why now I'm patron of the community foundations, and I do it because it allows me to celebrate their lives, but also gives me a sense of satisfaction that Australian South Sea Islanders or South Sea Islanders, they play a really important part of my life. It's a rich cultural history, the Australian South Sea Islanders, and the plight of the Australian South Sea Islanders, the Blackbirding, the Kanakas, how they've made a really important contribution to Queensland history and Northern New South Wales history, particularly in the sugarcane industry and certainly the railway. So please, have a look at our history.
Thanks to Imelda, we got hold of that interview, and it went out throughout the Pacific on Australian Network on our Newsline program. We ran about 7 or 8 minutes of Mel Meninga and his brother, and the brother is very amusing as well. Could I now invite Warren Jolio and Rowena Triev to join me up here? We'll take our seats. There was to have been a third person here, Jeanette Kirk. Jeanette is a nurse, and she told a very interesting story at Ormiston House the other day about she eventually qualified as a nurse, but initially she was told when she was 16 or 17 at school by a careers advisor to forget about nursing, they don't take black people. But her parents were proud and insisted she continue with her dream. And she said the proudest moment of her life was being introduced to Fred Hollows, Professor Fred Hollows, when she was in charge of the trachoma and eye health program for the whole of southeast Queensland. There are many South Sea Islanders who have made a terrific contribution. Can you still hear me? Good. In this session here, we've called it A History Not Forgotten, and this session is a time for the telling by Australian South Sea Islanders of their history in Queensland through both personal and family experiences, and exploring how Queensland, the landscape, hides many unspoken truths about our past. So I'll be asking Warren and Rowena to talk for a little bit, but then we'll ask a few questions and throw it open to questions from the floor. So Warren, Joe, Leah, if I could start with you. Warren is a prominent elder from the Rockhampton area, and in many different roles has been working for years to get recognition for Australian South Sea Islanders, along with his wife Monica, who is also with us today. Warren, Joe, received his OAM medal for his contribution to the Indigenous Australia South Sea Islander communities and the whole of the community. He's well known in this area, up and down and along the coast of Queensland. So Warren, if I could start with you, could you just tell us a little bit about your story, what you remember about being told about your ancestors coming here?
Well, actually, as a kid, we wasn't told anything about it, just that we were Australian South Sea Islanders by my father. When I first started school, he said, when you go to school today, they'll ask you, what are you? He says, and you tell them you're an Australian South Sea Islander. And I didn't know what that was. But anyway, the teacher did ask me what I was. I said, I'm Australian South Sea Islander. It was around about 1939 when I started school. And well, I went through life actually as a young fellow, because after finishing school, I finished in 4th grade, halfway through 4th grade. But this was up in the air when I started school in Jarvisville School, because that's where I was born in there. And we come back here to Rocky in 1943. Because Dad's mother, my grandmother, she passed away in 43, so he come back for the funeral. And I don't think he had enough money to come back up to here. So he stayed here and he got a job at Lace Creek, and we come up after. He wasn't going to come back up there, I think. So we come back here to Rocky. And I stayed with his sister in Elphinstone Street. And them days in Elphinstone Street, from Elphinstone Street to Ford Street, where all the South Sea Islanders lived down there in Creek Street and Ford Street. That was just between there, that was just Brigalow Scrub. And me and my eldest brother, we used to walk through the scrub. There was a path through the scrub, and we used to walk through the scrub every weekend to go down and play cricket down with all the boys down 4th Street. And then from there we went over to the boarding house near the railway station. And the police seen us walking from the baker shop one day and follows us down. And when we seen the police coming in the car, we raced down the laneway, and they come down the laneway in the car. I seen where we went into was back of the boarding house, and they come in. And they asked my mother who I called Auntie all my life, and that's what we wasn't going to school. We lived just across from school, from the Understand School. And I told my husband, she said, when he comes home. Yeah. So when he came home from work, I told him about when we got caught with the police because we wasn't going to school. And he packed up and went down to Joscali. And that's where his mother and father lived. They were from Vanuatu. Granddad Leo was from Pentecost Island, and Granny Leo was from Oba Island, now called Ombai. And the thing was, it was strange because they lived in separate huts. Because one being from Oba and one being from Pentecost Island. And it just didn't add up. But then if you've ever been over to in the islands over in any one of the islands, you didn't marry out of your own group. So Pentecost Island, where my grandfather lived, well, he couldn't marry anybody else but
Pentecost.
from his old, from his own group on the island. And even anywhere else on the same island, you couldn't marry them. You had to marry them, otherwise you get killed.
Within his own language group, huh?
Yeah. And they'd done away with you, see. So when he married a woman from Oba Island, well, that wasn't on. So when they end up at Joscali, because while they went to Joscali, there was supposed to be a sugarcane start-up for the industry there, for the Australian South Sea Islanders. And it never eventuated because it's all sand, Joscali, it's all sand. Right? And so they started over in Yeppoon, the other side of Yeppoon. That's where the sugarcane started. But it only lasted there for about 15 or 16 years or something like that. And they pulled up, there from the big sugar mill that they had there, and they sent it to Mackay. And that's where it finished up in Mackay. And that's where the sugar took off from there and right up north.
Did you ever hear any stories about how they were recruited? How they were brought?
It was through Robert Towns, who they named Townsville after. Robert Towns, he was a bloke that got all the boats. He got all the boats to go over to pick up recruits from over and ran about 80 islands from over there, and also the Solomon Islands, where my mother's father came from. And that's how they started recruiting. And it was pretty horrific, I think, on what they'd done. Because in the beginning, it was all good because they show them things what they can bring home when they finish their 3 years term. But it never happened that way, never that way. When they come out, the first couple of shiploads that came back, went back to Vanuatu, but after that the boats took them anywhere. So from 1863 to 1904, actually, it was straight through, something like 202,000 people were brought out from Vanuatu and the Solomon Islands. In around about 1922, my grandfather on my mother's side, who I never ever knew until I was about 27-year-old, because she died when I was 2-year-old. Her father, my grandfather, his name was Jack Malata. And Malata's place on Solomon Island. I don't know what the Jack Maratta must have been his right name, but he went under two names, Jack Maratta, Jack Malata. And he got flogged that much up in the Ingham district, around that district. He got flogged and he got flogged insane. And he had 3 daughters. Auntie Lottie Oliver, she married James E. Oliver, Uncle James. My mum, her name was Nancy. And Auntie Myrtle Bacco, she married a Bacco. Sam Bacco, the footballer, well, George Bacco was his uncle. And that's the other Auntie Myrtle, and she's still alive. She's 96, I think, today, 96 or 97 today. But the thing was that when Dad lost his first wife, my mum, he married this other girl looked after us. Well, we called her Auntie, and he ended up marrying her. And then I find out that she was a half-sister to me mum. So I said, well, what's coming? I called her Auntie, nearly all of, 27-year-old, I was still calling Auntie. And me and Monica married, and we had our first child, Carmen. And when she started talking, I said to Mum, I said, I've got to go over and start calling Auntie Nan. So my children will call her Nan, see? And when I went over and I called her Nan for the first time in my life, I was 27. She got the shock of her life. And when I got back home, sorry, I'm losing it a bit here now. Oh, goodness, sorry about that, people.
That's certainly all right.
And she followed me back home in Rockhampton, and followed me back from her place. She only just lived down the road there, and she bought this photo. She says, this is your mum. I said, what? She says, this is your mother, Nancy. It's my sister. I said, so, you know, it's sort of a shock to you, what you go see, you know. It didn't go as much as what the old people did. And so that's what's going on in my life. But my grandmother and grandfather not living together in the one grass hut, I couldn't work that out because they were from different islands.
Yeah.
And they were frightened, I think, that somebody come over from the island and found them and might have killed them or what. I don't know. You know, but there's strange things on what our island people done up in the islands, you know. A lot of it, especially on Pentecost Island anyway. And that's how when I went back, when we went over for the first time, when we found out where we actually come from, although we were born and bred in Australia, our people came from the Vanuatu, New Hebrides in them days. And so we went over to find out what island we were from. So the grandfather and grandmother never talk about that. Never talked about where they came from. And they didn't go back there. I think for the simple reason, because they were from different islands, they probably got killed by their own people.
When did you go back?
I went back in 1994. 94.
What was that like?
Hey?
How did you feel?
Well, when I walk down the street in Port Vila, goodness me, and run across our cousins, you can see straight away. Oh, it was just unreal, it was. Yeah, it was unreal, you know. And of course, as soon as they found out who you was, well then bang, come on. And we went up to the village in Port Vila. And oh man, met them all, eh? And then they told us in what village over in Pentecost we come from and that. So we caught a plane and went over there. That was in 94. 95 we went back, 96 we went back. And we ended up building a house up there in Pentecost. It's finished about 10 years ago and I haven't seen it. I haven't seen it. So anyway, yeah. Some of the things that I was going to come here and talk about, and they sent it on. Joanne sent it, my daughter sent it out down to us. Going to put it up on the screen.
Right.
Yeah.
Is this?
Oh, yeah, that's me there, and that's my cousin this end, and his cousin on that other end. They're two brothers, Arus.
Where was that taken? Where was that photo?
That was 94.
Ah.
94 and 95, we went over 96, we went over all the way going up to Pentecost Island. And I lived in the grass huts, and I still do live in the grass hut, but I built a house. There's a big fellow on this end here, he says, "Yo, I'll look after your house for us." No, you look after, you get inside that house. That's what he used to. And he got the shock of his life. Hey, I said, "You live in the house." I said, "I might not come back. I go back home, I might die." You get in the house, yeah.
That's terrific, Warren. Rowena, could I bring you into the conversation? Rowena's a prominent Australian South Sea Island elder from the Mackay region and has been a very active contributor to raising awareness of Australian South Sea Islander history. Rowena's grandmother was taken onto a boat as a young girl and brought to Australian shores near Mackay and remained there for many years. Rowena, could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'd be honoured to talk about my grandmother. My grandmother's journey started in 1875 when her and a friend of hers was walking along the beach on Ombai Island at Wallariki was the name of the beach, and they were gathering seashells to make necklaces. After some time, they looked up and they saw a schooner anchored in the bay, and they could see two men in a rowboat rowing towards the shore. What happened after that was something that was to change the lives of those two girls forever. The men grabbed the girls, put them in the boat, and took them out to the schooner. They were then placed in the hold of the boat. The name of the boat was Barrabel. It was one of those labour ships that were calling at the different islands throughout the Pacific, collecting people to work in the emerging sugar plantations in Australia, mainly Queensland, and this boat was headed for Mackay. The girls were very traumatised because they did not know where they were going or what would happen to them. When they, after they were out at sea for some time, they let them out of the hold of the boat because they were in there with other islanders that were being collected from different islands, and they were allowed to come up on deck. The girls were assigned jobs to do. They had to scrub the deck each morning and day. Some of the islanders were frightened and they were determined to get away, and they wanted to swim back home. But Those that jumped overboard were either shot or taken by sharks. The journey took 3 months after they collected from the different islands, and they arrived in Mackay, where they were. There's a Leichhardt tree at Mackay, which is famous for, is a heritage piece, known as where the South Sea Islanders first came to Mackay. They were taken off the boats, and then they were given two sets of clothes, a blanket, and they were assigned to the different sugar plantations. Now, Katie and her friend Lucy were assigned to Ashburton Station. Now, Ashburton was about 19 miles in distance from Mackay, so what they had to do was walk that distance, and then they were put to work. Their job was to clear, because cane was being grown on hillsides mostly, they had to clear timber and clear the land of grass and everything. Now, it was really hard work. It was from daylight till dark. But the girls and the men, there was lots of men, hardly any, there wasn't very many girls taken on the trip, but there was a lot of men that needed to do the work. But these two girls had to work too, as well as the men, because they weren't deemed good enough to work in the houses of the plantation owners. Katie was at Ashburton for 25 years, and then she had the opportunity. There was a rule that after a few years, the islanders were given a return passage home to the islands that they came from. So by that time, Katie had a daughter, so she decided to take her 3-year-old daughter back to the islands and see her family. She stayed over there and helped her relatives clear the land there and plant their crops with her newfound skills. But Katie had got so used to living in Australia that she came back after, she used her passage to come back after 9 months. Then she started at another station, Alexandra Station, and there she met and married a Willie Marler, and they had 2 children. One of them was my mother, so after a while, after a couple of years, Willie Marler decided to return to Fiji and work for the CSR over there. So Katie was left on her own with the children, even though she had, they both had exemption papers, so that allowed them to stay in Australia. After a while, Katie worked found another job on a horse and cattle station. On that was a very, the woman on that property was very kind, and she was a Christian lady, and she took Katie in and showed her how to cook and clean and bake bread, and Katie spent several years working for this woman. The woman also had a big influence on Katie's life, and because she was a very kind Christian woman. And Katie was able to have her children there with her. I still have at home a letter written by the lady to my mother, reminiscing of the days gone by when she said that my mother used to carry a mat around from their drawing room, and while this lady was sewing, she'd come up to him and say, "Sing, lady, sing, missus, sing, sing." She wanted to go to sleep. And so I've got that in a book of my treasures at home, which I value greatly. Katie had a hard life. When her children went to school, then she worked in the Homebush Sunnyside area outside of Mackay. And she decided that she would look after her children and work for the plantation and the mill people's houses, which she did. And every Saturday, she had joined the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and every Saturday she'd walk 38 miles to go to church at Farley, outside of Mackay, and return. And she'd be joined by, Lucy would go with her, and she'd be joined by all other islanders along the way, and they'd go to this church. Now, this went on for years. Religion played a very important part in the lives of the islanders. It helped them to be able to cope with all the difficulties and things that they found that sometimes would get the better of them. And they had this, the Anglican and Presbyterian churches introduced them to Christianity. Today, throughout all churches in Australia, you can see their representatives being represented in those churches. When Katie was working on the plantation at Ashburton, they used to have them out working, and they'd be supervised by men, overseers, sitting on horses with whips. And sometimes when they didn't think Katie was working fast enough, they'd box her ears for her. So after this happening several times, Katie must have thought, had been a bit fed up, so she ran away and hid in the Mackay cemetery. When she was found, they punished her and took her back to the plantation. When they punished her, after they'd punished her, they put shackles around her legs, around her ankles, and she had to walk the 19 miles back to this plantation.
How old would she have been then?
She would have been about 47, I think. Yeah. Oh no, she was younger, because that was before she went over to Vanuatu when she had her daughter. Back. No, she must have been about in the 30s then. And so you know, that brave little woman carried those marks of those shackles around her tiny ankles until the day she died in 1944. She continued working, and then when she was 67, she couldn't get the pension because they weren't recognised by government, so they had no pension. So what did she do? She decided to lease some land from a farmer, 5 acres it was, and it was he only let the acreage go because it had scrub and grass and everything on it, and it was rocky, so she took it, and so she had to clean this land to grow her cane. She cleared the land herself with a mattock and hoe, and then she went and she'd walk 3 miles to a neighbour's and get some cane, which she cut into small pieces and took to back home in a sack bag, carried it on her back, and then she'd plant her cane. Each year, as it came round after crushing, she'd crush the cane, and she'd cut the cane for crushing, and she'd carry it to the siding, drag it to the siding, get a end of a farmer's horse and take it to the siding, and it'd go to the mill. Racecourse Mill has in its records, old records, that Katie grew badilla cane. If anyone knows anything about cane, she grew badilla cane, and in amongst that was a record crop she grew, and inside that, with that crop, was a stool of cane that had 32 stalks of cane in it. And that's not a bad effort for a little old island woman.
What an extraordinary story.
Yeah.
Look, we're starting to run out of time, but I would like to invite anyone in the audience to pose any questions to either of these two remarkable people. Can I see a hand up anyway? Yes. There's a microphone coming down.
With the passing of the Constitution of Australia, and after 1901, I think it was, correct me if I'm wrong, the date about 1903, there was repatriation of South Sea Islanders back to Vanuatu and other areas. We haven't had any comments. This must have been a very traumatic experience with some of the people. Have any of you had experience of relations that were repatriated, and how do they feel after being in Australia for a number of years? How do they feel going back to their island community?
The people who arrived before 1880s something were allowed to stay, but many thousands were actually repatriated. Do you have any knowledge, either of you, of any relatives who...
No, I haven't, but what I've heard from my parents who were alive then, they said that many of the islanders were taken back to the islands, were repatriated, as you say, but many of them ran away and hid in the mountains, and they were sheltered by sympathetic farmers. And a lot of them, but when they were taken back, the unscrupulous captains of the boats didn't take them to the islands that they had come from. They just dropped them off or wherever they saw fit, and they didn't take them back to their proper islands. So then you get, you sometimes see Pacific Islanders, you know, in places where you wouldn't expect to see them, you know.
Joe, did you know of anyone?
Huh?
Any of your ancestors apart from the ones who remained, who had to go back that you know of?
No, they're all gone. Yeah. But that's a long time, eh?
Yeah.
Really out here.
Is there another question? Yes, certainly. Sorry, where are we?
When I visited Solomon's, I came across a member of Parliament who was born in Bundaberg. I didn't have a big time for story there, but my understanding that some of the ones that were sent back were born here, had no idea of custom, culture and whatever, and they caused a bit of conflict over there because they didn't understand that what the life they lived over there, they took over here, they took over there. And that's when maybe the word Kanaka was derogatory in that fashion. My story was told by Pastor Festus Farmeyer in Solomon's, was that was a story, that it was when the people who didn't know what they were doing was wrong, and that's how the word might have been derogatory in that fashion. My grandfather was dropped off at the wrong place. The chief allowed him and his mate to stay in the cave until another ship came. But my grandfather was allowed to stay here because he had a family of 7. His children had gone to school here, and even my dad had to pass the immigration test, and yet he was here schooling. But we remained in Nambour. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've run out of time, I'm afraid. We're going to have to move on to...
You can keep going if you
Sorry?
want. We've got a little bit more time if you want.
Oh, sure. Sorry, there was someone wanting to make a comment. Did I see?
A lot of those who were members of Parliament, the ones that repatriated and who were able to become leaders in Vanuatu, Solomon's, wherever they were.
Thanks.
Is there anyone else who would like to ask a question or make a comment? Right. Thank you both very much. That's been excellent.